Great rising, grasshoppers. I am so glad that you are back with me this week. My name is Ma'ati Tanetter, and I am a social studies teacher at Denton Magnet School of Technology. And today we are going to continue with our chapter on the Vietnam War years. And remember what I had said, we study history to hopefully learn from the past, to explain the present, to prepare for the future. So let's go ahead and get into it. If you have this hard copy packet, we are in section 2, the Vietnam War years. Now, as I had said before in previous weeks, if you want to follow along as I go through the information, you can. If you have a highlighter or pen that you would like to use to highlight information, you can. Or you can just listen and come back to this lesson later on when it is on the YouTube channel. It is completely up to you, but make sure that you are in section 2 if you have the hard copy. All right. Now, our 2 standards that we are going to be dealing with are the same ones we had last week. Number 8, describe how the United States' role in the Cold War influenced domestic and international events. And also number 9, critique major social and cultural changes in the United States since World War II. Now, once again, this is President Lyndon B. Johnson. We had talked about him about 2-3 weeks ago. He was the successor to President Kennedy after he was assassinated. All right, and he, like Kennedy, wanted to stop the spread of communism. Okay, let's get those dendrites going. This is our Bellringer. If you were there, it is 1965. And you have just been elected to Congress. You know voters are concerned about events in Vietnam, and you are carefully following the progress of the war. No one knows what will happen if the United States gets more deeply involved in the conflict. It might turn back the tide of communism. On the other hand, thousands of young soldiers might die. Would you support sending U.S. troops to Vietnam? Why or why not? I'll give you a second or two to think about that. Now, this is one of those dilemmas where the Congress had to decide, do I support the president in his fight to contain communism? But that could also mean the fact that many young people are going to die. So do I sacrifice their lives in the process of upholding what the president wants to do? So it's a little bit of a dilemma that, Congress had to answer at that time. So our key terms, we have the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, and that gave military authority to President Johnson. Ho Chi Minh Trail, paths and tunnels that were used as a supply route to by the North Vietnamese. Escalation, policy of increased involvement in the war followed by President Johnson. William Westmoreland, he was a commander of the U.S. ground forces in Vietnam. Our second group of key terms, search and destroy missions. Policy of finding hidden enemy camps and destroying them with massive firepower and airstrikes. The Tet Offensive, series of coordinated surprise attacks launched by the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese on the Vietnamese New Year, which was January 30th, 1968. Doves, opponents of the war, and hawks, supporters of the war. All right, let's jump into it. President Johnson, he had spent most of his career focused on domestic issues. If you remember, he was the president that signed the Civil Rights Act in 1964. He also was behind a lot of domestic programs that were geared toward education, that were geared toward housing, and things like that. But his goal one of his goals was like other presidents before him, and it was to stop the spread of communism around the world. Now, why do you want to stop the spread of communism? What's so bad about that? The main reason is because that many presidents felt like communism was a threat to the security of the United States. So they felt like we need to contain it so that it doesn't get out of control, so that it's not a threat to our security. So the Vietnam War was going on. All right, excuse me. On August 2nd of 1964, something kind of funny happened. The USS Maddox reportedly exchanged gunfire with North Vietnamese torpedo boats in the Gulf of Tonkin. Now, if you remember from last week, North Vietnam was communist and South Vietnam was not, and South Vietnam was getting the support from the United States. All right, 2 days later after that, during some thunderstorms, the U.S. ships reported a second attack. Now, the captain of this particular ship, the captain of the Maddox, he was not sure that his ship had been actually attacked, but the USS Turner, which was another ship, had claimed to have picked up some high-speed vessels, okay, on the radar. Either way, President Johnson, he was of this mindset. Well, I'm going to declare this as an act of war, and I'm going to do what I need to do to get what I need to get, all right? Because we are going to go ahead and shut this down. So what ended up happening was this. After the naval battle in 1964, he had asked Congress to give him the power for military action. And this is where the Tonkin Gulf Resolution came into place. And Congress went ahead and passed it. And that particular resolution basically said this: you need to do whatever you need to do to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States. So, as a result, the first U.S. combat troops were sent to Vietnam in 1965, and the role of the United States in Vietnam got bigger as a result. Now, unfortunately, many people felt that the way that President Johnson handled the United States involvement in Vietnam, it was not very successful. That was one of the dings on his record as a president. All right. Excuse me. So, along with the ground troops or the strikes, one of which was called the Operation Rolling Thunder, they were ordered to disrupt this thing called the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Now, what's the deal about this trail? This trail was a network of paths and tunnels that was used by the North Vietnamese to get supplies. Now, the thought process was this: if we can destroy this particular trail, or at least interrupt it, then we can disrupt their supply flow, which means they won't have anything to fight with, which means that we can go ahead and end this war, all right? So that was the thought process. Now, the problem was this. The Ho Chi Minh Trail was located in neutral countries like Thailand and Laos and Cambodia, places like that. So the U.S. soldiers could not surround it on the ground. So what they ended up doing was attacking from the air. And in addition to these bombs that they had dropped, U.S. warplanes released this thing called Agent Orange. And Agent Orange is an herbicide, almost like Roundup, the stuff that you might spray on weeds to kill. But of course, Agent Orange think of it as Roundup on steroids. It was just that powerful. Here's an interesting fact. The reason why Agent Orange was called Agent Orange, it wasn't because it was colored orange per se, it was because of the stripe on the container or the barrels that this particular herbicide was stored in. So that's why it was called Agent Orange. So these chemicals, they burned forests and they killed vegetation to increase visibility from the air. So they killed all this plant life because Vietnam, the climate over there is very, very warm, very humid, and whole lot of brush. And they couldn't see where this trail was going, so they had to kill that off. You know how sometimes you solve one problem, but you create another one in the process? That was the situation with Agent Orange, because years later, people that were exposed to it developed a myriad of health issues. So that was that. By 1968, more than 1 million tons of explosives had been dropped on Vietnam in an effort to try to go ahead and end the war, but it didn't. It did continue on. So now we're going to be looking at the U.S. soldiers in Vietnam. So starting in 1965, like I had said before, they were deployed to Vietnam. And President Johnson followed a policy of escalation in the war. That basically means more involvement, more equipment, more troops. By 1968, more than 500,000 U.S. troops were in Vietnam. Now, the American generals, they thought that this would be a quick victory. Okay, we're in there, let's do this, we're out. But it didn't turn out that way. This was a different type of war. The troops were not used to fighting in the way that the North Vietnamese was fighting. It was guerrilla warfare. You're going to hear me say that again, and I'll explain what that is later. General William Westmoreland had developed this strategy called search and destroy, as in look for who we think are the enemy and, well, destroy them. Here's another FYI. Jeremiah Denton Magnet School of Technology was named after Senator Jeremiah Denton. Now, before he became a senator, he was a Navy Rear Admiral during the Vietnam War. Now, he, along with other soldiers at that time, including John McCain, were taken prisoner and held in a prison camp in Vietnam. Now, his claim to fame was this. He did a televised interview as a prisoner of war in 1966. And his claim to fame was, he said with his voice, oh, they're treating us well. But with his eyes, he blinked the Morse code torture. Now, how he did it, I would imagine Morse code is a series of dots and dashes. So how he did it may have been like a short blink would have been a dot, and maybe a long blink would have been a dash. So he spelled out the word torture with his eyes with this televised interview so that people who were looking, his superiors and people who knew that he was a prisoner of war, they knew that this is not, what I'm saying is not true. They're actually torturing us, so send help. So that was his claim to fame, and that is our namesake at the school that I'm teaching at. So FYI for you. So the U.S. soldiers in Vietnam, unfortunately, they were at a disadvantage. They did not know the geography of Vietnam. The Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese used guerrilla tactics, which meant you didn't see them right away. They used secret traps, they used landmines, things like that. You could call it, in the sports world, they had home field advantage, okay? They knew the local geography. It allowed them to make quick surprise assaults on small groups of U.S. soldiers. A lot of times the civilians got caught up in the crossfire, which was unfortunate. They also received supplies from China and the Soviet Union. So all of this was going on to help the North Vietnamese soldiers to be successful in their attacks. Now, the Viet Cong forces, they entered villages at night, and they killed people that they believed were cooperating with the South Vietnamese government. And as a result, South Vietnamese and American troops, they attacked villages that they had suspected of assisting the Viet Cong. Sometimes they got it right, sometimes they didn't. And as a result, many South Vietnamese civilians were driven from their homes, and the U.S. troops lost a whole lot of support as a result of that. Now, a couple of FYIs about the typical U.S. soldier in Vietnam. Typically, They were between 18 and 21 years of age, which is very, very young. And about a quarter of them were drafted. What does that mean? It means that they were kind of forced into branches of the military. And most of the time, the men that were drafted, they came from minority groups and poor families. If you were a college student, and based on our text, if you were white, a lot of times your parents could get you a draft deferment. That's generally the way it was, which caused some problems back here in the States, and we'll get into that in the next section. Soldiers, they faced constant danger because, as I said before, they were not used to this type of fighting, which was called guerrilla warfare. They did not have the advantage of knowing the terrain. And one particular soldier said this: "We required this kind of instant hair trigger alertness." In other words, they always had to be on point because they never knew what was going to happen. The Americans won many battles, but they were it was very rare that they could hold what they had gained. So this is a different type of war altogether. Now, in this map, as I had said before, let's put these map skills to work. All maps have a legend or a key. This one is no different. We have our compass rose, north, south, east, and west. If you look at this map and you use your legend key, where are the areas of prolonged fighting? North Vietnam or South Vietnam? I'll give you about 30 seconds. All right, if you use your map skills and you see where the prolonged fighting was in South Vietnam, you are correct. Most of what prolonged means it just kept going and going and going and going. Now, North Vietnam took some hits too. You can see the major U.S. airstrikes, but the prolonged fighting pretty much was in South Vietnam. All right, now on January 30th, a lot of times there might have been a ceasefire on this particular date because this was the new year in Vietnam. But on this particular date, in the year of 1968, the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong, they launched a series of attacks. And of course, the South Vietnamese soldiers and the US, they were thrown off because normally not a whole lot happens because this is a holiday. The South Vietnamese, they regrouped and they were successful in fighting off the enemy. Now, in February of 1968, General Westmoreland, he had asked for more troops, but he was denied that. He didn't get what he needed. And as a result of this particular attack, a lot of Americans were kind of like, you know what, maybe we don't need to be over there. Maybe we need to go ahead and just pull out. This is not our fight. Which leads us to hawks and doves, all right? Now, unlike other wars before, Americans could actually see what was going on in the battlefields because it was televised. And as a result of that, a lot of Americans were like, no, they need to come on home. That particular group was called the doves. Now, a dove historically is a bird of peace. Now, there was this other group who felt like, no, we need to be over there because a threat to our security is a threat to the world. We need to support this war. They were called the hawks. Now, a hawk is a bird of prey. So you had these two groups with their opinions about whether or not we need to be over in Vietnam. Now, one particular event called the My Lai Massacre basically turned a whole lot of Americans off to the support of the war because of what happened. This particular general and his men went into a village and they expected to find Viet Cong forces in My Lai. Now, their search and destroy mission turned into a massacre because American soldiers, they opened fire on these group of people and they killed about 500 unarmed villagers, women and children. It was a disaster. So at first, the US military, according to our text, tried to cover it, but former soldiers testified saying, no, it didn't happen that way. This is what happened. So because of events like that, And because the fact that you could actually see all of this going on, many Americans were like, we're not in support of this. And this was the first time, because in previous wars, Americans, galvanized and did what they could to support the soldiers and, the military in their efforts to fight the war, especially like in World War I and World War II. So we got a skirmish going on. We've got a divide in the country. We've got our doves, we got our hawks. And that led to some problems domestically in the United States. And we'll talk about that in our next section on next week. Now, next week, we are going to be talking about the end of the war in section 3 for chapter 14. As I said before, you can catch this lesson on our YouTube channel later on. I'm so glad that you could join me again today. I hope that you can join me for my last lesson next Wednesday. In the meantime, I do want you to stay healthy and helpful and calm. And remember, you are in the middle of history right now. Please, 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 when you think about it, journal everything that's going on right now. My name is Ma'ati Tanetter, and I will see you next week. Bye-bye, my grasshoppers.